finished your point in the meeting. It was clear, it was complete, and then the room went quiet for 3 seconds and you panicked. So you kept talking. You restated what you already said in a slightly different way. You added a qualifier, you softened the landing with, but I'm open to other perspectives. And by the time you stopped, you had taken a decisive statement and turned it into a suggestion. 3 seconds of silence did that. Not the room, not the people in it. Your discomfort with the pause did that. Today, we're talking about the fact that you are talking yourself out of authority in every meeting you walk into. And the women who command the most attention in any room, they've learned something that you haven't. Every thought doesn't need to be said. Hello, sophisticates. Welcome to Brains and Baubles Live. I'm Davina Dandridge. I'm not a licensed therapist or a counselor. I'm an emotional empowerment strategist, author, and professor. I study how emotions drive decisions, and I help accomplished women in leadership stop operating from emotional patterns that no longer serve where they're going. If you're a director, VP, founder, or senior professional, your day is built on communication. Meetings, negotiations, presentations, difficult conversations. You know how to speak. That's never been an issue for you. The issue is that you don't know when to stop. And what you don't realize is that the silence you're afraid of is the most powerful communication tool you're refusing to use. You treat every pause like a crisis, like the room is going to collapse if you don't feel it. So you keep talking past the point where your message has already been complete. And every word after that point shifts the power in the room away from you. You're not just weakening your message, you're redistributing your authority to everyone else at the table in real time. And you're doing it because the quietness makes you nervous. Here's something you can apply in your very next conversation. Make your point, then count to three silently in your head before you say another word. That's it. 3 seconds. If the room responds, let them. If the room stays quiet, let it. Those 3 seconds will feel like 30. Okay, that's normal. That discomfort is the emotional pattern, not the reality. The reality is that 3 seconds of silence after a clear statement communicates more authority than 3 minutes of additional context. Now, let me show you why silence feels so threatening. Because it isn't about communication skills. This is more about emotional survival and is sabotaging your presence in every room you walk into. Let me tell you what's actually happening when you can't stop talking. You make a recommendation in a leadership meeting. The recommendation is sound. You've done your analysis. The room could hear it, consider it, and respond. But the moment you finish speaking and the room doesn't immediately react, something fires inside of you, a voice that says, they're not convinced. Say more, clarify, give them a reason to agree. So you do. You keep talking, you restate what you've already said, you soften the recommendation into a question, you open the floor before anyone asks you to, and by the time someone finally responds, the power dynamic has shifted. They're no longer responding to a leader who made a decisive recommendation. They're responding to a woman who appeared to second guess herself in real time. You handed them the authority that was yours 3 seconds ago. Here's what you haven't told anyone about this. You know you do it. You've watched yourself fill silences that didn't need filling and then thought afterward, why didn't I just stop talking? You've left meetings where your idea was strong, but your delivery undercut it because you couldn't sit in the quiet long enough to let it land. You've watched other leaders make a statement and then sit back. No additional context, no softening, just the statement and the silence. And the room leaned in. The room takes them seriously precisely because they didn't chase the response. And you've wondered what they have that you don't. You know it's not your intelligence, it's not better ideas. It's the willingness to let the silence work. And the thought you've never say in a professional setting is, I'm afraid that if I stop talking, the room will decide that I don't have enough to say, that the silence will make me look like I ran out of substance. So you overfill every moment to make sure nobody reaches that conclusion. But here's what you need to hear: the room is not judging your silence. You are judging your silence. You're interpreting the pause the same way a hypersensitive person interprets a neutral comment. You're assigning meaning that isn't there. The room isn't thinking, she must not know what she's talking about. The room is thinking. That's what silence does. It gives people space to process. But your emotional system has decided that their process is their doubting. And that assumption is running your entire communication. Now, here's where this gets specific to you and where it separates from simply over explaining. You don't just feel silence because you're defending a decision. You feel silence because you learn through real experience that when you're quiet, other people feel the narrative for you and that it was never in your favor. Somewhere in your career, you sat in a meeting, said nothing, and afterward heard that your silence was interpreted as uncertainty or disagreement or lack of preparation, or worse, agreement with the position that you actually opposed. You learned that silence is a vacuum, and in that vacuum, other people assigned your thoughts, positions, and limitations that weren't yours. You stopped being quiet, and it wasn't because you loved to talk. You couldn't afford to let someone else narrate your silence. That experience was real, but the room you're in now isn't that room. The authority you hold now isn't the authority you had then. And the protection strategy you built to control the narrative in hostile environments is now preventing you from using the most commanding communication tool available to you: silence. That's the emotional pattern running your communication, and it's producing consequences you can measure. Your emotions, the anxiety around silence, and the fear of someone else narrating your position, shaping your thinking. I need to keep contributing to maintain control of how I'm perceived. That thinking drives the behavior: talking past your point, restating what's already clear, opening the door before anyone challenged you. That behavior creates an environment where the room stops treating you as the authority who just spoke and starts treating you as someone who isn't sure of her own position. People begin reading your pauses as invitations to redirect because you've trained them to expect that your silence always leads to your softening your stance. Your leadership presence shrinks not because of lack of substance, but because you give away your power. In the seconds after you deliver it, you give it away. Emotions, thinking, behavior, environment. Your avoidance of silence is running this cycle. And if you don't interrupt it, you will continue to be the most prepared, most strategic person in the room whose contributions land at half their potential because you can't stop talking long enough to let them land at full weight. Here's how we can reframe this and let this land. Silence is not the absence of leadership. Silence is the concentrated power. And in rooms that were not built for your voice, it's the most strategic tool you have. Let me be specific. The ability to know when to just be quiet is as important as knowing what to say. But for you in the rooms that you occupy, silence does something that additional words never will. It shifts the power dynamic. When you make a clear statement and hold the pause, you force everyone else in the room to respond to your position instead of watching you dilute it. You're no longer chasing their agreement. They're now engaging with your authority. That is a fundamentally different dynamic, and it changes your political standing in every room where it happens. Silence is a negotiation strategy. When you hold the pause after a proposal, the other party feels the silence. And what they fill it with reveals their actual position, their concerns, their flexibility, information they would never volunteer if you were still talking. Every word you add after your point gives them cover. It gives them something to respond to that isn't your core position. Silence removes that cover. It puts your statement on the table and it says, your move. In rooms where you're the only woman or the only woman of color or the only person whose authority isn't automatically assumed, silence does something else entirely. It refuses to perform. It refuses to overprove. It communicates without a single additional word that you are not here to audition. You're here to lead, and the room will adjust to you, not the other way around. Every word you say after your point has been made reduces the impact of that point. The first statement carries authority. The second statement explains the first, which signals the first wasn't strong enough. The third statement apologizes for the first two. By the time you've added a qualifier and opened the floor with, but what do you all think? You've taken a decisive position and turned it into a committee discussion. Silence after a clear statement does the opposite. It tells the room, I said what I meant, and I trust it's enough to let it stand. And it's not about being arrogant. That's executive presence built on political intelligence, the kind that you don't learn from a workshop, the kind that accumulates as capital every time you hold the pause and let the room come to you. Here's what this means for you specifically. Your discomfort with silence is not a communication issue, it's an emotional issue. You're not feeling silence because you have more to say. You're feeling it because the quiet activates an old belief that your value is tied to your verbal output. When you can see that belief clearly, you can interrupt it. The emotional sophistication map is designed to show you where that belief operates, which rooms trigger it, which audience is activated, and which context you can already handle silence with confidence. Because the pattern isn't consistent. There are moments where you're perfectly comfortable with quiet. Understanding the difference between those moments and the ones where you fill every gap is how you take control of this. Let me walk you through how to use the self gut check in the exact moment your silence gets hijacked by your emotions. You've made your statement in the meeting, it's clear, it's complete, the room goes quiet. And the impulse arrives, say more, clarify, add context. That impulse is your trigger. Pause physically. Don't open your mouth. This is the one situation where the pause itself is both the intervention and the skill you're building. Breathe. Name what you're feeling in silence. Is it the fear that they're judging what you've said? Is it the assumption that silence means disagreement? Is it the discomfort of not controlling what happens next? Name it, because the impulse to speak feels urgent, but you can name the emotion driving it. The urgency loosens its grip. Now ask, is this true? Is it true that the silence means your point didn't land? Or is it possible that the room is processing? Silence after a strong statement often means people are thinking. That's respect, not rejection. Is it true that you need to say more? Or is the point already made? Is it helpful? Will speaking right now increase your power in this room or decrease it? Think about what you've observed. Every time you've watched yourself talk past your point, you've watched the room's attention shift. They stopped engaging with your position and started waiting for you to finish. The helpful move right now is to hold the silence and let the room come to you because the person who holds the pause holds the power. The person who feels it gives it away. Is it timely? At this level of leadership, in this room, with these stakes, is this the moment to chase the room's approval? Or is this the moment to let the room sit with your authority? Because every second you hold the silence, your position gains weight. And every second you feel it, you give the room permission to treat your position as negotiable. If the answers to all three is no, stay quiet. Let the silence hold. Let the room come to you. Now, let me tell you what happens on the other side of the 3-second pause. Someone responds. They engage with your actual point, not the softened version. A conversation starts from a place of strength instead of a place of qualification. And you walk out of that meeting knowing that your leadership was experienced at full volume, not because you spoke out the loudest, but because you trusted your words enough to let them stand alone. Let me give you a scenario so you know how this works in a high stakes room. You're a VP sitting in a quarterly business review with the executive leadership team. The CEO asks for input on a proposed restructure. Two of your peers, both of whom have been in the room longer than you, share their positions with the usual amount of political hedging. And then it's your turn. You have a clear position. You've done the analysis. You know how this restructure will create a gap in operational continuity that nobody has addressed. The old pattern, you state your concern clearly, it lands, but the room doesn't respond in the first 2 seconds, so you keep going. You restate the concern in a different way. You soften it by acknowledging the merits of the current plan, and you end with, but obviously, this is a group decision. The CEO heard a strong position for a half a second. Then he watched you walk it back in real time. By the time you were done, he heard caution, not conviction, and the room moved on. New pattern. You state your concern in 2 sentences. This restructure creates a gap in operational continuity between Q2 and Q3 that will affect client delivery timelines. I recommend we phase the transition over 2 quarters instead of one. Then you stop. You hold the pause. The room goes quiet. The CEO looks at you, your peers look at you. Nobody speaks for 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, something happens that never happens when you over explain. The room takes your position seriously. The CEO asks a follow up question, not to challenge you, but to explore your recommendation. Your peers adjust their position in response to yours. You just shifted the direction of restructure to an executive level, not because you said the most, but because you said exactly enough and then trusted the silence to do what silence does. Force the room to engage with your authority instead of your explanation. That is political capital. That is what silence produces in rooms where every word is measured. And it's available to you in your very next meeting if you can hold the pause. Here's how the gratitude journal supports this specific skill. Every evening, write down one moment where you used silence intentionally. One meeting where you made your point and stopped. One conversation where you held the pause instead of filling it. One moment where you trusted the quiet. You're building evidence that your silence works because right now your emotional system believes that silence is risky. The journal gives you documented proof that it's not. After 2 weeks, you'll have 14 examples of moments where you held the silence and your outcome was positive. Nobody questioned your competence. Nobody filled the gap with an assumption. Your authority held. The evidence rewires the belief. Ecclesiastes 3:7. A time to rend, a time to sow, a time to keep silence, a time to speak. And James 1:19 says, let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak, slow to wrath. Both of these scriptures are telling you the same thing. Silence is not passive, it's intentional. Being slow to speak is a discipline. It requires more emotional intelligence than speaking quickly, not less. Knowing when to be silent is as much a leadership skill as knowing what to say. That's what separates a good communicator from a commanding one. And the centered confidence that comes from this discipline, the ability to sit in quiet moments with no pressure, no nervous chatter, no compulsive need to fill the gap, that's where your true authority lives. The self gut check interrupts the impulse in real time. The gratitude journal builds evidence that silence works. But the deeper question is, why does silence feel so threatening in the first place? This is where SOPHI becomes essential. SOPHI is my sophisticated emotional strategist, and she's built for the private excavation this requires. Because here's what you're not going to tell your team. I keep talking after my point is made because the last time I was quiet in a room like this, someone decided my silence meant I didn't have a position. You're not going to say that to your boss. You're not going to say that to your husband. But that specific experience or that collection of them is running your communication in every room. And until you work that out, the self gut check will keep having to fight the same impulse for you. SOPHI helps you to explore. Which rooms taught you that silence was dangerous? Was it the meeting where you held back and someone else took credit for the direction that you were already thinking? Was it the performance conversation where your manager read your silence as disengagement when you were actually processing? Was it the culture that you came up in where the quiet person was assumed to not have anything to offer? Or was it the experience of being the only woman or the only woman of color at the table, where your silence was never given the benefit of the doubt the way it was for others? Here's what I've learned personally: managing your emotions in high stake moments starts long before the moment arrives. You don't develop self regulation during the negotiation, you develop it before the negotiation. The work you do with SOPHI between the meetings is what gives you the ability to hold the silence during the meeting. You're not going to suddenly become comfortable with quiet because someone told you it was powerful. You become comfortable with it because you've done it. You've done the emotional work to separate this room from the rooms you were taught your silence was a liability. When you understand the origin, the impulse weakens. The self gut check interrupts the moment. SOPHI helps you understand why the moment exists. Together, they build a new relationship with silence where quiet isn't threatening, it's powerful. Let me show you what happens when you stop being afraid of quiet, because the transformation isn't subtle, it's visible. The first thing that changes is how you feel in the room. You make your point, the room goes quiet, and instead of panic, you feel composed. You're not scanning faces for validation. You're not rehearsing additional context in case someone pushes back. You're sitting in the silence the way a leader sits in the silence, with the confidence that what you said was enough. Your contributions start landing differently. People respond to the full weight of your statement because you didn't dilute it on the way out. Negotiations shift in your favor because you've learned that the person who speaks first after the silence often concedes ground, reveals their flexibility, or weakens their own position. You stop giving that ground away. In politically charged rooms, your silence becomes your reputation. People learn that when you speak, it's worth hearing, and when you pause, the room waits because they've learned that your silence is as intentional as your words. That's political capital. You can't buy that with more talking. It's only built through discipline. Your ideas gain traction faster because the room receives them as positions, not as proposals waiting for permission. In negotiations, you start noticing something you never saw before. When you hold the pause after a proposal, the other party talks themselves into your terms. They fill the silence with concessions, alternatives, and reveals that give you leverage you didn't have to ask for. Silence becomes your information gathering tool. The less you say, the more they show you. In one on one conversations with your team, the silence becomes your leadership tool. You ask a question, and instead of filling the gap while they think, you wait. And what happens is remarkable. They go deeper. They share things they wouldn't have shared if you had kept talking. They bring you the real issue instead of the surface one because you give them the space to get there. Your leadership becomes more effective not because you're doing more, but because you're saying less and you're listening more intentionally. Beyond the conference room, this changes how you exist in every relationship. You stop filling silences in conversations with your husband to manage the emotional temperature. You let the quiet sit when it needs to sit. You discover that some of your most productive conversations happen after a pause, not during continuous dialogue. Your friendships deepen because you're present instead of performing. You listen to understand instead of listening to respond. Your decision making improves because you've created space for your own thinking. When you're not filling every moment with words, your mind has room to process. The strategic clarity that comes from quiet reflection starts showing up in your relationships. Your plans are more precise. Your direction is more confident. Your vision is more articulated because you gave yourself permission to think before you spoke instead of thinking while you spoke. The organization you lead feels this shift directly. A leader who is comfortable with silence creates space for her team to think, contribute, and innovate. She's not dominating every conversation, she's facilitating them. The room becomes more collaborative because people feel permission to pause, to consider, to offer something thoughtful instead of something fast. That's the culture of a leader with emotional sophistication, and that's the environment she creates. This transition begins with the emotional sophistication map. It shows you the specific rooms, audience, and situations where silence triggers your anxiety versus where you're already comfortable with it. The pattern reveals exactly where the old belief is still running your communication. Once you see it, you interpret it with the self gut check. You process the root with SOPHI and you document your process in the gratitude journal until silence stops being something you survive and starts becoming something you use. In your next meeting, make your point and count to three before you say another word. If the room responds, engage with that response. If the room stays quiet, hold the silence. See what happens. I promise you nothing bad will happen. What will happen is that your statement lands at full weight for the first time without you undercutting it on the back end. Start the gratitude journal. Every evening, write down one moment where you held silence intentionally. After 2 weeks, read the list and see the evidence that quiet is not a liability, it's a leadership advantage. The next time you feel the impulse to fill the gap in a conversation, use the self gut check. Ask, am I about to speak because I have something to add or because the silence is making me uncomfortable? If it's the silence, hold it. If this conversation names something you do in meetings but hadn't connected to your leadership presence, like this video, leave a comment telling me the type of meeting or conversation where you know you feel the silences most. Subscribe to this channel because we have these conversations every week. Take the emotional sophistication map at davinadandridge.com. It shows you where silence triggers anxiety, where it already feels natural, so that you can close the gap between the two. Your next step after the map is the Self-Gut Check Method course. At my website, it gives you the full framework for holding silence with intention. SOPHI is available as well for private strategic work on the emotional beliefs that make quiet feel dangerous. The most powerful thing you will ever do in a room is hold the pause. Not because you have nothing to contribute, because what you've already said was enough, and you trusted enough to let it stand. The room will come to you. Learn to let it. Thank you for being here on Brains and Baubles Live. Until next time.